Good evening. On behalf of the Institute of Politics, the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, the Social Policy Professional Interest Council, which is the student group at the Kennedy School, and the nonprofit Policy and Leadership Program, I'd like to welcome you to the Kennedy School of Government and the ARCO Forum. I'm Julie Wilson. I'm the director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce a very remarkable woman who's played a key leadership role at both the local and the international level, dedicating much of her life to children and their families. This is a topic of crucial importance to those of us who worry about the future of our country and, more importantly, of the world. When we heard from Robert Rubin earlier, I think many of you might have heard from him, he was talking about the financial health and the financial viability of helping poor children. Carol Bellamy gets at much more fundamental issues. The lives of children. Will they be healthy? Will they survive childhood? As they pass through childhood, will they be enslaved? Will they be worked? Will they be allowed to grow up to the problem that some of us are very fortunate in this country to face, the lives of healthy, happy, and very rebellious adolescents? Many of the world's children never grow up, never live long enough to give their parents the kinds of joys and problems that many of us struggle with regularly. Carol Bellamy has spent half her life in the public sector and half her life in the private sector, pulling on both to address these problems. She's currently the executive director of the United Nations Children's Fund. For those of us who trick-or-treated for Unicef, we know it by its initials. And on this, their 50th anniversary, she's going to be talking to us both about UNICEF and about one of the most important issues that UNICEF is addressing. You may remember Carol's political life in New York State and as president of the New York City Council, where she took on the really tough problems: how to reduce infant mortality, how to reduce teen pregnancy, how to increase the rate of childhood immunization, how to increase the rate of prenatal care, how to get food to pregnant women and medical care. She's worked at this at both the individual frontline level as a Peace Corps volunteer and at the more systemic level, trying to change the way hospitals work, the way the state government works, the way the city government works. She's really looked at this issue from all directions and is a remarkable woman now to be heading UNICEF and looking at it at the international direction, at the international perspective. So, Carol, I'd like to welcome you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate your very nice introduction. We walked out and somebody said, "Oh, good, there's some people here," so I feel I should give you the opportunity. If you're looking for Bob Rubin, he's finished already, so that's over. Although you did say, Bob Rubin just talked about the financial side. This is more important. No, Bob, it isn't really. We love you also. Keep that economy going well. And if you're looking for George Will, he's in another place tonight. If you are looking for Carol Bellamy, you're in the right place, or at least at UNICEF. And I do look forward to this opportunity to chat a little bit. I am going to talk just a little bit about UNICEF to start with, but then I look forward to having some discussion about some of these issues and would welcome your comments, your questions. I ran into at least, and I see somebody else, but I ran into at least one person who, or a couple of people who work for UNICEF in the field. So I would welcome, as we talk about some of these issues, if those of you who've worked for UNICEF or in some position around the world have any observations, and even if you disagree, it would be good to get it out there, because I think that's how we learn about what's going on in the world today. Well, I'm actually lucky. I'm lucky for many reasons. One, I used to say when I was the director of the United States Peace Corps, which I was just before this job at UNICEF, I had the best job in the United States. Actually, I had the best job in the United States 30 years ago when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, which to this very day still is the most wonderful thing I ever did. I'm prepared to say that. I don't have to say that. Nobody pays me to say that. I still urge everybody, if they are ever thinking about doing something interesting, to spend a couple of years if you're an American in the Peace Corps. It just is the most extraordinary thing. But then I was lucky enough to be the director of the Peace Corps for a couple of years. Used to say I had the best job in the United States. And now I say, as the executive director of Unicef, I have the best job in the world, and I think I do. And I've even been there almost 2 years, and I still think I do, which is actually quite good. I've also had the opportunity in this position to celebrate being 50 twice, which is very nice, particularly if you've ever gotten to 50. And I don't see anybody in this room who looks like they've gotten there. But I got there several years ago, and luckily I got to get there again this year at UNICEF. UNICEF has been going through its 50th anniversary year. I've kept reminding everybody who kept saying, UNICEF is 50, I kept saying, oh, we're 49 getting to be 50. Particularly if you've gotten to be 50, you don't rush it. You take your time getting there. But literally yesterday was UNICEF's 50th birthday. So I want to start with a couple comments about UNICEF, and then I do want to talk about, in somewhat greater detail, this issue of exploitative and hazardous child labor, which was the subject of our State of the World's Children's Report for this particular year. A couple things. UNICEF was begun in 1946, 50 years ago, actually December 11th, and it was begun actually at the end of World War II. It was begun as basically a fund, that's the F in UNICEF, and as an emergency, that's the E in UNICEF, to respond to the emergencies at the end of World War II, basically to respond to the problems of children in Europe at the end of World War II. The need for food, for blankets, for housing, these were the issues. And so that was the beginning of UNICEF. It's gone through many transitions. I won't take you through all of those. Glad to comment on those in our discussions. And at one point there was a discussion in the 1950s and we are a UN organization. I also want to say that. For everybody who wants to dump on the UN these days, I want to say, okay, it's worth raising questions about the UN. Even I, and I will defend the UN to anybody. I think we could run ourselves better in some ways. I think UNICEF can run itself better in some ways. I think we can make some improvements in the UN. But I would also argue that for all the people who want to dump on the UN, they keep forgetting the different faces of the UN. And then when you say, well, did you know the UNICEF is part of the UN? Oh, well, I like them. Well, you know that refugee agency? Oh, well, they're okay, too. That World Food Agency? Oh, are they part of the UN as well? So there are many faces of the UN that I think people forget exist. They just think of one face. And even when they think of the peacekeeping face, they forget about some of the many aspects of that peacekeeping face. So we are part of the UN. But we have been at work now for 50 years, and we find ourselves in some ways with a great deal to celebrate at 50 years, and also with some real challenges ahead. We've been intimately involved over these 50 years in children's health, and in fact, there's a great deal to celebrate there. Not everything, there's still challenges, but there have been extraordinary advances. And again, not only because of UNICEF, but UNICEF has taken the lead in many ways. Infant mortality rates have virtually been cut in half over these 50 years. From 25 million young lives being lost annually 50 years ago to about 12 million now, still from preventable reasons, so that still means we have a way to go, but cutting in half the number of infants who die from preventable reasons. We've been involved in watch this, I said to somebody a little UN speak, interventions. I realized as an American I really was in trouble when I said progress one day, and I said, now, did that used to be progress? And now I'm saying progress. But we've been involved in ways of trying to respond to children's health needs that are not highfalutin philosophical, but very understandable, low-cost, low-technology interventions. If any of you remember my predecessor, an extraordinary person, Jim Grant, who used to whip out of his pocket this little packet of oral rehydration salts, a very simple, understandable issue that would help reduce the terrible issues of death and illness from diarrheal problems that little children would have. Preventing mental retardation in children. The major cause of mental retardation in children is the lack of iodine. What's the best way to get iodine? Well, just a little iodized salt. We take it for granted in this country, but it doesn't exist everywhere. So the ability to help begin to introduce iodized salt in many places. something as simple as a 2-cent vitamin A tablet, which can, or vitamin A, which can reduce blindness and, in fact, death of children. So UNICEF has been involved over these 50 years in many different ways of helping to reduce both death and illness among very small children, among infants. And so we stand at our 50th birthday really celebrating enormous advances, but understanding the challenges that exist. One of the important things, I think, is to recognize where the progress has been made, and as I said, infant mortality rates cut in half, polio on the verge of being wiped out. Not yet. It's estimated that 80% of all children are now immunized against polio. We still have 20% to go. It may be almost as hard as the first 80%, but just like smallpox, we really truly believe that within the next 5 to 10 years, polio can be wiped out in this world. And let me give you a sense of that. The Americas now, not just the United States and Canada, the Americas are polio-free. The United States and Western Europe together each year spend over $500 million US a year just to keep their parts of the world polio-free. Think of what would happen if we can wipe out polio in this world, of how you could invest those resources in other ways. And it can be done. This past week, there was another one of these major national immunization days. They usually take 1 or 2 days or 3 days. But in India, ready for this one? I mean, I always keep thinking they have the wrong numbers. I come from New York. We never kept our numbers right, you know. 135 million youngsters immunized. Not just by UNICEF. We were a part of it. We were part of a broad coalition. It's extraordinary. So that's a possibility. Guinea worm wiped out. Moving toward, not there yet, measles. So there have been enormous advances. On the other hand, we recognize in our 50th year there are still challenges to go. The issue of malnutrition among children is still a very difficult issue. It isn't just the issue of severe malnutrition that kills. It's also mild and moderate malnutrition that may not kill, but will stunt growth, that will preclude children from studying adequately in school and really can make a difference. The issue of maternal mortality is something that UNICEF takes very seriously, but needs to take even more seriously. And it's not just UNICEF. The world does. Too many women die or are injured in the course of pregnancy or giving birth, and it's too acceptable in this world, all over this world, that this should be accepted. It shouldn't be accepted as much as it is. So we need to challenge that. The issue of education. More children today are going to school than ever before in this world, but it's still estimated that over 100 million children don't go to school who should be in school. And of those, close to 2/3 are girls. It would make such a difference. It makes a difference in health care and the family care and everything else. So girls' education. The issue of violence, and I'll take it back from where I started. We started 50 years ago, out of World War II. 50 years later, a terrible symmetry, because there are probably more children in the world today who are caught up in some form of armed conflict than in this entire 50 years. And we could just name the countries, some of which have been on television. You will have heard of those names, and others of which you'll go, oh, really? Do they have a war there? But children that are the victims in these wars. The 20th century started, the majority of victims of wars were military. That's not good, but they were military. The 20th century ends, over 90% of victims of wars today are civilian, largely women and children, and very often the targets in these wars, because the wars of today are wars where enemies try and hurt those that are the closest to you, and so women and children become targets in these wars. And so our ability to try, not just UNICEF, but our ability to try and respond to children is so implicated by the conflicts that are going on in countries today. So we celebrated our birthday, we cut the cake, we blew out the candles, we celebrated, and really had some wonderful things to celebrate. But it was also a day for, not just a day because we've been celebrating this whole year, but it was a time for recognizing the challenges that remain ahead. Now, let me take on this one other challenge for a second and then stop. One of the really extraordinary things that's presented itself, if you care about the world, not just children, is that over the last 6 years, a simple but very compelling international law, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was first introduced in 1989, has now been ratified by 187 countries in the world, leaving only 6 nations in the world right now that have not ratified it. Of those 6, 2 are about to, the nation of Oman and the nation of Switzerland. Of the remaining 4 are the Cook Islands, recently an individual country, Somalia, which doesn't have a government to speak of, the United Arab Emirates, which it is thought might, if Oman ratified. And then, I know this may come as a surprise or may not, this country that we're standing in, the United States. So of the remaining 4 countries, the only major country in the world not to even ratify. And let me make clear, as we all know, that ratifying doesn't mean that everything's perfect. There are many countries that are not doing a lot for their children. But nevertheless, there is at least an impetus to try and do something for the children. But the United States has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Nevertheless, the increasing recognition in the world today that children are not just little teeny things that, gee, if you feel sorry for them, maybe you should do something for them. But they are human beings who breathe, who have rights, the right to good health, the right to good quality education, the right to a world that is not filled with violence. And this is something that is increasingly informing the work that Unicef does around the world today. So we chose in our 50th year to devote our State of the World's Children report, which is one of our 2 flagship publications that we put out each year, to focus on children's rights and to illustrate the issue of children's rights, particularly to talk about the issue of exploitative child labor. And I emphasize the word exploitative or hazardous. We are not suggesting that children can't have their paper route. We're not suggesting that all work is terrible. We acknowledge that some work of children actually is quite constructive and can be useful in the development of children. We're also not saying that, that you can wipe out even exploitative child labor overnight, because we don't think you can. We recognize that many children are involved in some form of exploitative labor because, in fact, they are making an enormous financial contribution to their families. But we wanted to add to the growing international momentum against this really complex and global problem of exploitative and hazardous child labor. And so we focused our 1997 State of the World, so I'm going to whip it out here. I'll do a dramatic reading. No, State of the World's Children report on the issue of child labor. I'd be glad to go into some detail if you want to. Let me just throw out some figures, not all of which are just ours. The International Labor Organization recently did a good statistical report that really, I think, was very useful. It is estimated that close to 250 million children between the ages of 5 and 14 or 15 years are involved in some form of exploitative or hazardous type of labor. You may think automatically, and we put it on the front, I must say, of you know, the Kathy Lee Gifford clothing sweatshop children. Thank you, Kathy Lee. Although it did focus on this issue, or the rug, the children that work in the rug factories because of their small fingers, or they make the soccer balls or the baseballs, and we put on the cover a young child from Central America who had fallen asleep while he was helping to make these balls. Well, in fact, that is true, but we point out in this report that may only be 5 to 10% of the exploitative child labor in the world. It is also, exploitative child labor is also domestic servants, very often very young, largely girls, not necessarily acknowledged as part of child labor. They are bonded laborers, children who are sometimes forced into some kind of child labor to pay off a debt of the family. They are the millions of children who work long hours with and for their own families, very often fetching firewood, water, looking after animals, tending the fields. They are street children, children who make a living on the street. They are children who are exploited as prostitutes or are caught up in commercial sexual exploitation. They are often, if you look at the official statistics, it would look like there are many more boys than girls, but if you look through those official statistics, they are very often girls who, because of their gender, carry extra burdens. So they are boys and girls. They tend to be quite young. They are quite exploited, and they are working in very hazardous conditions. We challenge some myths. We challenge the myth that you have to do away with poverty before you can deal with child labor. And we say no. We acknowledge that there's no simple solution to child labor. You can't just say, okay, stop all the factories, throw everybody out in the street and everything is fine, because we know that some families absolutely subsist only on the earnings of their children. But we also point out that in some cases, those earnings of the children are a substitute for the earnings of the adults who could otherwise be employed, but in fact the children are employed even at a lesser rate, and therefore their parents aren't able to get jobs because the children aren't employed. We acknowledge that there are no simple solutions. We urge very strongly that there be immediate stopping of the hazardous nature of child labor. We point out that child labor, while about half of all exploitative child labor is to be found in South Asia and maybe another third in Africa, it also is to be found in the so-called developed world, whether one goes to the sweatshops of Chinatown in Manhattan or the agricultural fields of California, where children may be, generally immigrant children, are working in conditions where in the agricultural fields they may be subject to pesticides and other kind of chemicals, or machinery that is very dangerous machinery, or in the sweatshops are subject to really terrible conditions. So it exists in all parts of the world. We urge that there be an acknowledgement that this exists and that the world takes some actions. But we acknowledge again that there's not a simple solution. We say stop the hazardous nature of and exploitative nature of child labor. We say there is no way to deal with any of these issues without understanding and without overemphasizing the important link of compulsory, good quality education. That's not a total answer, but the fact is, if we don't invest in our children, in our educational systems for children, we will never be able to reduce exploitative child labor. This will have to probably be done in conjunction with a number of other kinds of activities. It isn't just forcing children into school, it's understanding that there are many children who still do not go to school, and so you need more flexible school systems. They probably need to be closer to the children. Some of them could be informal education systems because of the large number of girls who are not in school. We need, and not just only for girls, but we need more women teachers. But education is a key in this area. We talk about the very important need to collect good information in this area. That doesn't just have to be dry statistics, but without good information, you don't have the tools. We talk about, as well, the need to have good laws in this area. Laws alone won't solve child labor, but without them, you won't have the tools to do them. We talk about the importance of registration of children at birth. This may sound silly to somebody here in this country or some of the other developed countries who assume that you always have a birth certificate. But in many of the countries of the world, you do not, and you don't even exist as a human being. So if you don't exist, it's very easy to dispose of you from your northern village in Nepal down into a brothel in Bombay, and nobody will ever know that you ever existed. So the importance of each child being actually registered as a child. We talk as well about this being not just an issue in which government is involved, but also the private sector as well. And multinational and transnational corporations have to accept some responsibility and begin to adopt codes guaranteeing that neither they nor their subcontractors will engage in exploitative or hazardous form of child labor. The bottom line is that we do not think that our report will make exploitative child labor go away. We are not even suggesting the proverbial silver bullet, but we are giving some guidance as to steps that we think can be taken, and we hope that first of all, we, through our work, Unicef's work in the over 140 country programs where we are working, will continue to pursue these issues, and we hope that we will provide guidance for others as well. Finally, we point to some examples of activities that are going on, whether it's in Bangladesh, where the government of Bangladesh, along with some garment manufacturers and UNICEF and the ILO and others, have put together a pilot project, pretty significant project, that combines the garment manufacturers not employing young children, the children going to school, a modest financial subsidy for the families so that there will be some substitution for the income they expected to have gotten. The manufacturers of these garments can now sell their garments as not produced through child labor, so that is that's a marketing tool that they can use. We identify these kinds of examples, or the Rug Mark program in India, or some of the work with street children in the Philippines that's going on, or the work with child prostitutes in Brazil. So we offer some very specific examples of how to begin to reduce the impact of child labor. Well, I think I'll stop at about this point, other than to say that for UNICEF, our 50 years have been an exciting time. We think we've contributed to improving the conditions for children in this world. We could not have done it without our many partners, governments and non-governmental partners, individuals and organizations. We stand proud of our achievements, but cautioned by the challenges that remain ahead. I'm reminded, for fun, I like to hike sometimes. I'm not a pick and axe hiker. I just kind of put one foot in front of the other, but I'm reminded sometimes in my job that it's like hiking, because you get over one mountain and all of a sudden there's another mountain that exists. So while we celebrate the improvements in reducing infant mortality and some of the other areas, we remain challenged by the problems for children as we head into the 21st century. On the other hand, I suppose we remain energized by the fact that we have come this, not just UNICEF, but all of us have come this far, and in fact, there are more children who are healthier today, who go to school today, who are productive citizens today than 50 years ago, and we hope that in the next 50 years that will continue as well. I'll stop at this point, and I may not have touched on anything you are particularly interested in. I'll be glad to try and respond, but I gave you a little bit of an idea of what we're about these days. Thank you very much.
We'll open up the program to questions now. We have 2 microphones. We ask people who want to ask questions to line up behind the microphones, and we'll alternate going from one to the other. Please give us your name, and remember that this is a time for questions and not speeches. And while people are lining up, I'd just like to ask Carol a question. If people are interested in getting a copy of the annual report, just write to the United Nations and...
It's a very good question. I haven't the slightest idea. I mean, I suspect you write to the United Nations. I'm not sure that will do it. But if you write to us at UNICEF at 3 UN Plaza, we can try and help you get this. And let me put in a pitch for, we operate in the, I would call the developed world through, as I said, our 38 national committees. And we have a wonderful committee here in the United States, and we have a wonderful group of folks working in this, how do we call it here? The UNICEF New England, as I was just about to say. That UNICEF New England group is a really good group, and they can help you. And so I'm going to point out some of the folks from UNICEF New England, and we can help you try and get copies of these documents.
They're right here in Brookline, so
right.
They're probably in the phone.
Hello, my name is Archana Jaiswal. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School of Government, and thank you so much for being so personable and open to questions. I'm usually very fascinated and supportive of the work of the UN, but I'd like to take your challenge and present you with one of my burning questions. I'm from Canada, and Canada was recently proclaimed one of the best places to live. But my volunteer work was with a Native Canadian community where there was 95% unemployment. The youth suicide rates were 8 times the provincial average, and there was a whole host of social problems. It feels like the needs of the Aboriginal community were excluded and ignored from that report. My question is, how can the Aboriginal community in Canada access UNICEF programs and get greater attention and support?
Actually, that's a very good question, and the answer is probably not a great deal of access to UNICEF programs, although we also have a UNICEF Canada program. I actually just was in Canada just last week for official visit and participated, among others, in a very major conference on immunization in Canada for Canada. And a great deal of the discussion was how do they reach the unreached? In other words, the indigenous communities, the Aboriginal communities, because Canada's come an enormous distance, but as you point out, there are those who are unreached. One of the things that we at Unicef have tried to do in some of our work, for example, the Progress of Nations, is not only to look at the so-called developing world or the transitional countries, although that's where our money and our staff will go. But it is to, one, support our national committees, not just, our national committees, I say, the days of our national committees being, with all due respect, little old ladies in tennis shoes running around just selling holiday cards, and they do that, and if you'd like to buy any, we have some. But increasingly also the face of UNICEF or the face of the United Nations Children's Fund in raising issues that do not stop just at the borders of developing countries, and they are the rights of children, the right of children to avoid violence. Now, the violence in Rwanda may be a violence of war. The violence in Miami may be the violence in the community because of the difficulties in the community. The right to avoid child labor. The immigrant in Germany may be the servant in somebody's home, and the child labor in Bangladesh may be in the garment industry. The right to good health, and again, in Canada, it might be various areas. So we have attempted to focus our approach not just only on developing countries when we raise these issues. So we will continue to lend our voice, our moral outrage, our moral support, and we will continue to try and provide the kind of information, data, strength to our national committees in their various countries, wherever they are, no matter how rich people are. You may or may recall, but just this year, for example, there was a conference in Sweden on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation of children. It started out around the issue of sex trafficking in South Asia. But as governments throughout the world, began to think about what role they were going to play, governments began to realize that it happened in all of their countries, different ways. It might be female genital mutilation in Cameroon. It might be prostitution, sex trafficking in Thailand. There was this pedophilia problem in Brussels, but as bad as that was, it was so good it happened. I'm sorry it happened. I really feel terrible it happened, but it reminded people that things can happen in Belgium, and if they can happen in Belgium, they can happen in the United States, they can happen in Canada, they can happen in Italy, and it just is not some country far away. So our commitment is to continue to force these issues.
I guess what I wanted to do was raise your attention to the fact that in the community where I worked, 9% of the respondents to a survey felt that the needs of children were being met, 9%. And when I spoke to some people in UNICEF in New York about this, they told me that that was not an area that they'd be interested in. So.
Well, again, we will not be opening offices or putting staff in, but we will continue to push these issues very strongly. Over here, and then I'll go back and forth.
My name is Yuki Nose. I'm a pediatrician who's been involved in children's health and immunization for 10 years.
I'm always, now I'm scared because they always know more than I know, but okay.
No, we pediatricians very thanks to UNICEF for the oral rehydration therapy and immunization. But I just have some question for your opinion for the children's labor. I've been actually working in a slum area in Bangkok, in Thailand, where many children are engaged in labor. But the question I have is, it's very easy to say, okay, children don't work, but it's very difficult in practical way because of the opportunity cost and also the population structure. Because in many developing countries, 1/3 of the population is in the children, children's age
or young
below
people.
15 years old. So when you think about the dependency rate, which is dependent population divided by working population, if you say don't work children, so the working dependency rate will increase, and there is some economic impact to the society. That's my first question. And the second question is, you said, okay, it's very important to get away the children from the job which is very hazard. But when I noticed in Bangkok was many first the adult or father engaged in very like a dangerous job, and later the father died from the occupational hazard, and later because nobody could work, that's why the children need to work in that very like a dangerous situation. And what do you think of those things?
Well, let me again say, what we do not say in this report is, and you might challenge us on that as well, but we do not say boycott everything or stop everything, because we acknowledge that it's a much more complex problem. I mean, we're not so smart. We just acknowledge the complexity of this problem. And you can't just say boycott or stop, or in fact, we think, we're not opposed to that, but we say those are tools that should be used in strategic ways, or else everybody's just thrown out in the street. But we can't be the United Nations Children's Fund or any kind of organization, whoever we are, dealing with children, and sit there and say, oh, that's okay, they need this money, so therefore children should be exploited. And so what we're trying to do is give a range of interventions here about what can happen or what should happen, and to try and push governments to do that. You may or may not be aware, but just yesterday or day before yesterday, the India Supreme Court, and again, long way to go from this, but this is so important because if you look at the numbers of children in exploitative labor in India, it's huge. The India Supreme Court came down with a ruling banning a whole series of areas of exploitative child labor, calling for the creation of a fund that would subsidize education and families to a minimal degree, recognizing that it's a more complex issue. So my answer to you is, or my response to you is that we are not just saying everybody stop, because we understand there are contributions to be made. But if we don't take this issue on, then there will be never, or I shouldn't say never, but there will be much less reduction of exploitative labor than is possible. Finally, and I'll come back to the issue I made before, in many cases, children are hired or children are working as substitutes for the adults. Now, it's not that we want adults in hazardous conditions, but the fact is the children are put in even more hazardous conditions. In the long run, the family, it's in the long run, but the family will be stronger if the child is able to get some basic education in the first place than if the child never gets any education. The country will be stronger. To the extent that countries talk about their own economic conditions, they will be stronger. So I have to partly agree with you, but partly challenge you, because we can't not act just because this might have implications for the financial condition for families. We have to figure out how, in a sense, in a transitional period, we all, not only Unicef, contribute to some kind of financial assistance for the families, but we do reduce the exploitative nature. And the private sector has to help as well. I mean, they just can't, you know, with all due respect, you know, sports manufacturers can pay more and more and more to high-paid sports figures, but they can't think about putting a little bit more money into improving the conditions in their factories. Well, maybe the money, some of the money should be in putting some improvements in their factories, and not just only another $1 million or $2 million or $3 million, since they're making multi-millions, into some of the sports figures. So it's not as though money isn't being put into some of these things, and maybe it's a different way of putting the money into these situations.
Thank you.
My name is Sean Paul, and my question has to do with your vision for the future of UNICEF. And specifically, I'm hoping you can comment on my understanding that there's increasing pressure on UNICEF, along with other UN agencies, to make dramatic cuts in their level of spending for their programs. And is that accurate? Related to that question, is it being called into question whether UNICEF will be able to maintain its independent representation around the world? Another comment that I've heard some discussion on in terms of a vision for the UN system for the 21st century, and the call for a unified assistance agency consolidating UNDP or UNFPA and UNICEF. And I'm hoping you might be able to provide some insight.
Well, let me comment on all of them. There is some pressure to make some reductions, but that's because the overall assistance in foreign aid or overseas development assistance is down. My view of that is to encourage governments, and not only governments. UNICEF's budget is about $1 billion a year. We are voluntarily funded, if I can just give it a little background, which means that we have to go each year and in a sense, pitch ourselves to our funders each year. We are not guaranteed a certain percentage of it. You read about, oh, the U.S. didn't pay its money to the UN, blah, blah, blah. We have nothing to do with that. We have to go each year to each of the governments that support us who are governments that are part of the UN, and we have to say to the US or to Sweden or to Italy or to whoever, here, this is what we're doing, we hope you'll continue to fund us, and so on. And generally, they have. I mean, there have been some reductions, but no government has done a terrible cut. There have just been reductions because for many governments, there are reductions in their overseas development. But also, we raise about 1/3 of our money through, in fact, the cards, the products, the fundraisers. I'm wearing a watch that the German committee sells, which I feel like I'm the major contributor to the German committee. I keep buying them and giving them to friends, or the cards or the other things. So we raise about 1/3 of our money, which I actually think isn't so bad either, because it forces us to submit ourselves, in a sense, to the private citizen every year. It's a little bit more glorified than that actually happens, but do we still receive their support? So that's good. So there's not somebody saying you must cut, you must cut. On the other hand, I am saying, so you can yell at me, I am saying that for UNICEF, this is not entirely accurate, but to some degree our hiring went like that over the last few years when our budget was going kind of like that, and now our budget is kind of going like this. So we do have to make some reductions, not terrible reductions. I want to avoid my experience in doing budget reductions. I only come to organizations that seem to have budget challenges, but nothing like the virtual bankruptcy of New York City in the late 70s. So when people scream, and I don't want to be insensitive, if one person loses their job, that's terrible. But people kind of like moaning and groaning, and I think to myself, you don't know from what we had to do in New York City, but if any one person is affected, that's a real impact. So we are going to have to do some reductions, but it's not because somebody ordered us. The reality is resources will be down. The good news is there haven't been terrible cuts in UNICEF, but we are going to have to make some modest reductions over the next few years. But it's not just, what we also have to do is kind of squeeze more. I believe we can do that. So I don't think it's only cuts. I really think we can push some of it a little bit more. Now, so that it seems to me is just good management, if I might say. On the other hand, secondly, are we still going to be independent? Well, we are not independent. We are part of the UN. And I think we have to take that seriously and work closely with our UN colleagues and others. And to some extent, to the extent that maybe a few years ago we could kind of be, I don't want to have anything to do with them, or I don't want. No, we have to work more closely together. And so we're being encouraged to do that. And I think that's not bad either. So those first two things are not bad. Now, I'll tell you what I do think is bad. There are some actually very respectable organizations and governments who are suggesting that all the internal development agencies of the UN be merged into one. I wholly reject that, to tell you the truth. I don't want to sound like I'm just trying to protect turf. I think that's not wise. I think that would create a situation where you would have the lowest common denominator. I mean, you really need to encourage the best of individuals. UNICEF really does have some areas in which they bring some real competencies. UNDP has some areas that they bring some real competencies. World Food has some areas they bring some real competence. We don't have to all duplicate each other's, but in fact, we are the face of the UN. I think if everything's thrown into one big pot, we're all subject to one stupid big bureaucratic UN personnel system, you'll get the lowest common denominator. You won't be able to encourage people. You won't be able to really get really good work out of people. I don't mean it'll be awful, but it will be blah, and it'll look good on paper, and it won't accomplish very much. And to the extent that people are already kind of trying to figure out what the UN is, they won't be able to figure out at all what the UN is at that point. So I'm quite serious. You heard me. I think we have to be realistic about our budgets and have to make some modest reductions. I think we have to work closer together in the days of, I'm UNICEF, I'm terrific, nobody can touch me, I'm perfect. We have to work closer together. But to throw everybody into the same pot, I believe, does not understand the different strengths that some of the different pieces of the UN system brings. Furthermore, they're not suggesting, they keep talking about coordinating better, but they're only suggesting throwing 3 things into the same pot, and 10 things over here will not be in the same pot. So they keep saying, let's have real coordination at the field level. I sat in a meeting the other day with heads of all the different UN agencies, and I looked around the table and I thought, well, if this proposal to throw everybody in the same pot goes through, which isn't everybody, it's only 3 or 4 agencies, we'd still have 15 people sitting around the table. So you don't have anything more coordinated. So I say, run ourselves more efficiently, be good, tight, well-managed, do a good job, you know, justify your budget, show people that you're not just that you're not duplicating, but be identifiable pieces of this organization. Just don't be one big, huge blah, which is what I'm sorry, which I think we would become. So my concern is that. Yes.
Hi, my name's Steve Friedman. I'm an undergraduate. Could you just please briefly explain why the United States has not ratified the convention?
Oh, sure. Just briefly, I'll explain that.
Just give us the brief overview, please.
Would you like the 15-second explanation or the? I'm
20
sorry.
seconds,
No.
please.
I don't mean to be facetious, but I can't explain that. I can give you some comments on it, and let me be serious about it. I'm sorry. This is a very serious issue. But I can't tell you why. The U.S. has historically had a disposition against international treaties. The U.S. particularly feels, I don't want to use the wrong words, but partly threatened by international treaties. On the other hand, my argument, not just mine, our argument to the U.S. or to anybody else, at this point certainly, is you are not breaking new ground. Now, I'll say this again, 187 countries have ratified, 187 countries are not implementing, so there's a long way to go for these countries to be implementing, and even those that would purport to have begun implementing the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in other words, who presented reports to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, some of those reports, quite honestly, we understand, present a picture far more positive in the countries than really exists. But nevertheless, other countries at least have taken the step of ratifying, have taken the step, even modest step, of beginning to look at their legislation and to try and put it in some order. So I can't give you, in my view, a valid justification for the United States not having ratified. I believe, and if you look at the language of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, much of it actually is premised on language from the civil rights laws in the United States, with which the United States does have experience at this point. If the U.S. wishes to raise some objections, to raise some particular concerns, to raise some reservations, I would hope they wouldn't, but if they wish to, that's fine, because that's a role that the U.S. can play as other countries do. But I do not think there is a valid reason at this point for not seriously considering this before the U.S. Congress. Now, I would point out that, as you probably saw in the paper this week, the President of the United States finally sent the Convention on the Rights of Women to Congress, which I would also point out was signed by President Carter, any of you old enough to remember when he was president. So it takes a while for this country to get to dealing with these issues, and these deal with the rights of women. So it takes a while. Again, I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm only saying this is a very serious matter. Nobody should take it lightly. Just by saying we're for the rights of children doesn't mean that children have rights. But other countries in the world today are taking this more seriously, and we would certainly encourage the United States to take it more seriously than they have at this point.
Hi, I'm Jan Twombly. I'm a partner with the CPA firm of Levine, Zeidman and Deitch in Wellesley Hills, and a grassroots volunteer with Results, a citizens lobby that works to generate the political will to end hunger and poverty. And in reading the report, I was very much struck by the relationship between education and economic development, and in particular access to microcredit. Would you comment briefly upon the role that microcredit will play in alleviating exploitive child labor, and in particular the effect that achieving the goal of the Microcredit Summit, which is access to microcredit for 100 million of the world's poorest families, particularly the women of those families, could have on ending exploitive child labor?
Well, first of all, we think the primary issue that can contribute, and again, I keep making the point, there's not a silver bullet. If we had to pick our number one item, it would be education. But microcredit is running a close second, or economic vitality in the community. And we're just not talking about large corporate enterprises. Microcredit, or very simple economic activity at the local level, very often involving women, not limited to, but very often involving women. It's so interesting when you talk to women involved in microcredit projects who care enormously for their community, but you ask them about whether they are involving their husbands, and they say, oh no, they'd spend the money, and we're paying back the loan. Micro-enterprise, is very important. Very simple. It may be the loaning of one pig of a couple pigs in a community, and then there are more pigs, and then they can both have food, but they can also raise pigs and sell pigs. I mean, these are very simple kinds of projects. I remember seeing, and this is when I was Peace Corps visiting a project in Paraguay, where the men in the community had gotten their wives to sign for a loan because it was supposedly for women, and they did get the loan, but when they got it, the men got the money and set up, as the women had said they were going to do, a tienda, a little store, but they stocked it with all the things that nobody really was buying, and so the women finally got frustrated because nothing was being sold, so they took over the store. I must say there was probably a revolutionary Peace Corps volunteer who was helping them do this. But now people were buying for the store, and this group of women now were ahead of their schedule in repaying this loan off. It wasn't a huge loan, but it was a small loan. So it's one of the reasons, again, I'll come back to what we talk about education, and we talk very much about education for everyone, including girls, and the importance of girls' education. Because for Unicef, we are the United Nations Children's Fund, but the status of women in the world, their economic status, their education status, their health status, totally contributes to their entire family's situation. So that if that girl is able to get even that basic couple of years of education, we're not talking about secondary education, she is more likely to take more care on raising her family. She's more likely to be in a position to engage in some kind of very basic enterprise. She is more likely to think about how she spaces how many children she has. She's more likely to provide for better health care for her children, and therefore she doesn't have to have as many children. It's not, you can't have children. It's that if my children don't die, I won't have to have as many because I have them because I'm afraid they will die. So so much of it comes back. So if I can put in a pitch, as you may know, Results is sponsoring a is it international conference in February on the issue of micro enterprise, in which everyone from the World Bank to the United Nations Development Program to BRAC and others, I suppose, are going to be involved, and it, I think, is just going to be a very important contribution to increase understanding of how important microenterprise is. I, again, point out in Africa, women generally, I'm coming back to women again, it's not only women, but women are generally the economic contributors in the community, and so that these very small projects are very important. I mean, we talk about the globalization of the economy, and that's terrific, but when it really comes down to it in the community, it's the microenterprise that will make a difference.
Ms. Bellamy, good evening. I'd like to talk to you about soccer balls from Pakistan. Earlier this year, soccer balls from Pakistan came under extreme international pressure for the exploitative child labor employed in making them. And I'm sure you're aware that an interesting phenomenon occurred in that, much like tuna, which is now often labeled dolphin safe, an attempt was made to label non-child labor exploitative soccer balls as child labor safe. To my knowledge, this enterprise did not fly, and I'm wondering if you think that in the future we can look forward to consumerism taking an active stance against child labor as they have on environmental issues. I suspect your answer will be yes, an optimistic yes, and I, of course, hope so as well. But I'm wondering what UNICEF is also doing multilaterally with trade organizations such as UNCTAD and the WTO to put international pressure on such offending countries. What are the sovereignty issues involved? Can we get Pakistan to be more wary? And I was wondering, are there any other products that I may not be aware of as I do my Christmas shopping this year?
Well, there are many products. I mean, I've been asked several times in the last couple of days, well, are we recommending that there be a boycott of products? And no, we aren't. I will tell you, we are not. We are not opposing boycotts, but we are saying that I don't want to even say simple, that a boycott alone won't just stop things overnight.
Sure.
In part because the children potentially, and again, you're in a, we admit it, you're in a catch-22. It is terrible, but if they're thrown out on the street, that's not necessarily making their life better. What I wanted to open up was actually this report, this opinion from the India Supreme Court, and I don't mean to ignore Pakistan in this case, but just some of the, this Supreme Court decision out of India identified some of the major, they said the major hazardous industries. They actually didn't talk about some of this informal industries that we keep wanting to remind people as well, but they talked about, just to remind you of some things, because you said what else is there? They said matches, glass, brassware, lock making, slate industry, diamond polishing, gem polishing, handmade carpets. Just to remind you of some other things, because we think of the clothing or the rugs or the soccer balls, but there are other things as well. Honest answer is I'm not sure how much is happening in Pakistan, given Pakistan right now and the difficulties in that country. I think actually in terms of governments, even governments willing to intervene and take actions that at this point, at least our experience at Unicef, I don't mean Pakistan isn't doing anything, but our experience at Unicef is that both India and Bangladesh have engaged a little bit more actively than Pakistan has at this point in terms of the willingness to try and make some reductions in the exploitative nature of child labor.
Is the World Trade Organization
Well, I'm going to get to
receptive?
WTO
Okay.
and some others. What we hope will happen is not that all of a sudden consumers just walk away and boycott, but that consumers lend their voice and really do speak out and make it clear. Because you know what happens today is that increasingly industry has to understand that consumers walk away. I mean, in other words, the manufacturers don't control the markets, the consumers control the markets. And maybe if the consumers, and it's not so simple, but if the consumers continue to raise their voice or raise issues here, won't stop overnight, but that has a much greater impact. I mean, I spent, as you probably, as was said, half my life in the private sector. The bottom line is the return on investment. And if your consumers aren't there, or if you think your consumers are not going to be there, that begins to shape some of your thinking. So it isn't don't buy anything this year, but it is, I encourage people to participate in raising their voice on occasional boycotts or occasional direct actions and raising their concerns or sending their letters. And you may think, what the heck does that mean? But the more they hear, I mean, when I used to be president of the New York City Council, 7.5 million people in New York, but if I got 5 letters in the same day on the same issue, not 7 million, but 5 letters in the same day on the same issue, I knew something was happening because somehow that issue had somehow gotten through to people. Now, I'm not saying it can only be 5, but it doesn't have to be millions sometimes. It can be, something's happening out there, so we feel a sign. Now, let me talk about some of the other organizations. As you know, the WTO is meeting, or has been meeting this week. It's very interesting. They actually didn't want any of us to come to this meeting, if I might say. We couldn't even get an invitation. The ILO got an invitation, but I think we're invited not to speak. UNCTAD was there. I don't know what actually happened. So we're in a time, I suppose the good news is that it's a time of some real edginess on this. So it's not something that can be entirely ignored. But on the other hand, there are different agendas of some of these different organizations. And so we are looking at ways, without just standing there and again and waving our finger, but ways that we can bring our weight to bear, and others. We're not just saying it's only UNICEF, on organizations like the WTO and others, because the WTO is an important organization.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, time. Okay, yes.
My name's Peter Salama. My question's about the broader role of UNICEF and also the possible dangers of statistics if they give us a false sense of security. As a physician who has worked in Palestinian refugee camps, I was encouraged to see that Israel ranks very, very well on under 5 mortality rates. In fact, ranks better than the United States. But of course, we know that the Palestinians are excluded from those statistics.
Right.
My question really is there a broader role for UNICEF If the root causes of childhood mortality are political, is there a broader role for UNICEF in advocacy?
Well, I do think there is. I mean, I don't think we want to turn our back entirely on statistics, and I think UNICEF has been very effective in using as a model of some of its activity, really identifying some very specific objectives, a certain percentage of immunization coverage, other kinds of things, and trying to achieve those. Not just UNICEF, but really measuring those. And I think that's useful. I mean, yes, you have to use the best information you can find, and you try and do that, and you know that sometimes governments will give you information that's not entirely accurate, but it is a measure, and it gives you a sense of trends, and it gives you a sense of where we're going. Having said that, however, I think we have to be cautioned by a couple things. Not to lose the ability to do quantitative measuring, but to understand that some of the issues we're dealing with these days don't lend themselves as much just to quantitative measuring as well. I mean, maybe you can measure if children start school, but how do you measure the quality of education that will keep them into school? That doesn't lend itself quite as much to a quantitative measurement. So we at UNICEF ourselves are struggling with combining both the quantitative as well as the qualitative measuring. Secondly, we have to look through statistics sometimes. You just mentioned a perfect example. Another example is the increasing urbanization in the world today. You can look at where's my friend from Cairo who was part of the UNICEF program there. You can look at cities today and say, oh, well, it doesn't look great, but the health statistics or the sanitation statistics in that city look pretty good. But what you have to do is you have to, sorry, I'm back in my development speak again, disaggregate some of those statistics, because you've got to look through the overall statistics and get into that squatter community or that slum community or that barrio to understand that, yes, maybe sanitation looks pretty good in this urban sector, but in these three areas of that urban sector, there's no sanitation available, or what used to look like existed for a city of 200,000 does not exist for a city of 200 million. So my answer to you is, we will continue to use statistics because we think they are a good measurement, but we are trying to be sensitive to the fact that statistics alone sometimes can't give the full picture, and occasionally can be slightly misleading, and we need to continue to keep our eyes open to that as well. I mean, maternal mortality, if I might, is another example. I mean, we recently went back and with WHO looked at the maternal mortality statistics, and it turned out they were actually we think they are worse than they looked at before. But having said that, you would be amazed at how many governments squealed that, oh no, how can you say that? But when you finally started dealing with them, it turned out that was so. So we don't want to lose some of that skills, but we don't want to only be directed by numbers alone.
We have time for one more question. Okay. My name is Sandra Rahman, and I'm a doctoral student in international management. And I'm heading to
What is international management?
I'm heading to Bangladesh in a few weeks to talk to some of the managers in the garment industry, so I'm really looking forward to that. And the earlier question allowed you to touch upon some of my question, and that is, you had mentioned that multinationals should have a greater social responsibility in the area of ending exploitative child labor conditions. And I wondered what kinds of efforts UNICEF is doing to target those multinationals directly. Yes, the consumers will speak out, and I talked to some people about that, and they said that will affect the big name organizations, which are a handful, but the other name labels that we don't know about, it won't have much of an effect. So what kinds of things?
Well, we don't have a lot at this point, although we are doing it more through our individual country programs than we are doing it as a headquarters matter, not that we're running away from it. But I want to make the point again that it's not only just labels as well. I really want to make the point that you're only touching a little part of exploitative child labor if you're just looking at these export industries. I mean, one does have to look in a larger way. And then finally, let me say on this, is that we at UNICEF are evolving our role in the area of child labor as well. I mean, if I might be quite honest with you, we worked very hard over the last few years to try and encourage the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but all of a sudden we woke up one day, it wasn't quite this bad, and we said, oh my God, it's ratified, now what do we do? So we have been building into our programming, because we program. I mean, we have general policy that our board approves, but we try and program from the country level, because our program in Argentina actually looks quite different than our program in Chad. I mean, as you would expect. So we are trying to program in more at the country level how we can bring to bear some influence there. That's not to exclude the national. It's not to exclude, for example, this year we're not saying this solves the problem, but we've focused our State of the World's Children on child labor. We will be participating in 2 international conferences, one in February that is sponsored by the Netherlands government, one in the fall that will be sponsored by the Norwegian government. We will be participating in other meetings and conferences globally on the issue of child labor. We will send our experts out to speak and to suggest ideas. So we didn't just issue a report and then say, okay, now what else do we go to? We will continue to work in this area, but we're also going to focus at the community level as well. I only want to make one little comment. I know it's time, it has to stop, but on international management, for any of you who even care about management, because I kind of think I care about management sometimes. And one of the really interesting things about this job for me has been what I say managing a multicultural organization. And I'll tell you my bias here, because particularly if you are, as I am, somebody who comes from New York, you think you've managed a multicultural organization. Because, I mean, I have run different things, more or less, in New York, and you look around the room and kind of looks pretty multicultural to me. I mean, I don't mean just looking, I mean how, backgrounds and languages and so on. But it's actually very interesting, if I can speak in a sense, because mostly it isn't. Even if people are from different backgrounds, so whether they've been only a brief time or a long time, they've all kind of started acclimatizing to this. At the UN, and not just limited to the UN, also with multinational corporations, presumably these days, it really is a multicultural organization. And if I take an action that you think is just the stupidest thing you've ever heard of, and you let me know right away, you, based on your culture, you might not let me know until 3 months from now, but you may feel even more strongly than he feels. But for those of you who think about management sometimes, it's very interesting to figure out how do you not change people, but think about how you involve people in an environment where they actually have to make a contribution, but are able to make a contribution being who they are and coming from and respecting their many differences and their backgrounds and their cultures and the way they operate. I'm sorry, this is totally irrelevant to what we've been talking about, but it's just, I find it absolutely fascinating and really challenging if you're thinking about these issues. And since this is the Kennedy School, I mean, I don't know, does that ever come up in anything you're ever thinking about? I think about it all the time, and so in any case, it's very interesting. I thank you very much. I should probably, thank you, Sarah. Partly it's nice to be here. I feel a little bit at home, as some of you may know. In my old age, I've managed to have a number of contacts here. I actually was a fellow of the Institute of Politics in 1975, a long time ago, when none of this existed, mind you. We were in that little teeny building over there on Mount Auburn, that little building. I actually gave the graduation address to the Kennedy School graduates the first year that this building even existed, and none of those other buildings even existed out there. And I've had an opportunity to come back ever so often, occasionally when somebody couldn't figure out who to fill an evening with. So it's nice to be back here because I feel quite at home. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Carol and invite you back.